Good morning to all of you. I've been asked to announce that there will be a study group after today's lecture. There was some request for one after last week's lecture, and we couldn't arrange it then, but there will be today. Today's title, Transcendentalism, Bringing Meaning to Modern Living, demands that we first define what we mean by the word transcendentalism. Is that in direct reference to New England Transcendentalism, the teachings of Emerson, Thoreau, Alcott, and that group? Or are we talking about a wider philosophy of life? In fact, what we are talking about is a way of looking at the world that Emerson and Thoreau, the New England Brahmins as they were called, are good exemplars of, but certainly not the only exemplars of. It's a tradition that we can trace back to Egypt and perhaps even to shamanism. We can find it in every culture, every time, every climate. It's been called idealism. It's been called the ancient wisdom. It's been given the names of light, truth. Christianity, Buddhism, each have sects that can be described as deriving from it. In fact, all religions can be described as having some core that derives from this tradition, this way of seeing the world. The world we live in today is changing very, very rapidly. The advent of intercommunication systems, simple things that we take for granted like telephones, and the effect that they have on our ability to communicate across the globe in an instant. The various forms of travel which have been developed, including space travel. The various scientific breakthroughs in genetic work, in psychophysics, and in psychology itself, have radically transformed the nature of the world. In reading a book from the 19th century, one has to be struck by how similar it is in thought to what we think today, not to how different it is, for the simple reason that the world that these people lived in was so radically different from the world that we live in. It should surprise us that in spite of that, the thoughts, the problems, the mysteries were perceived in the same ways as we do. The same questions were asked of creation. Today we have more knowledge to bring to bear on the question. Today we have more complexities and greater worries. We have looming over us problems unlike those faced by previous generations. We have to face political necessities that other generations have not. Never before have we stood in the specter of the possibility of destroying the human race entirely. Never before have we stood before the specter of destroying the globe itself. Many are pessimistic. Many feel that there is no escape from this problem that faces all of us, that eventually, through a mistake, through anger, through ignorance, the inevitable will occur and there will be the destruction of the globe. But I beg you to consider this from a different angle. I ask all of you to consider that in our own lives, we progress when problems strike us. And the more severe the problem, the quicker the evolution. Problems, stress, ordeals demand that we reach deep within ourselves to find answers to them. No problem ever faces us that we cannot solve. We have created the problem, and in that very creation we have included a solution. The solution to the problem that faces us today, the problem of political stress and the nuclear situation, is, I suggest to you, what we've been calling transcendentalism. It's a perspective on the world and on life. It's a philosophy of common humanity and of spirituality. We could talk about the history of it. and we could astound ourselves at the similarities between the descriptions of it that all these different cultures produce. It can sometimes be almost uncanny that a book written thousands of years ago will describe a certain process, a certain way of seeing the world that will agree completely with a book produced 1,000 years later in a culture that had no contact with the one mentioned first. Two different places, two different times, two different schools of thought. The same truth comes to fruition, stated in a slightly different way, often stated in so similar a way, however, that one could swear it was the same author who wrote it. Now, we can speculate and drag reincarnation in and everything else, but we don't need to, because the fact is that the source of the ancient wisdom is not to be found in Egypt or in Mesopotamia or in India. The source is to be found within each of us. The true root of the tradition, the authority on which it rests, is within our souls. It must be proven there, and it must be discovered there. As a tradition, it serves to guide us, it serves to inspire us, to give us a sense of optimism we might not otherwise have, a sense of community. It is good to know that others have come before us and have experienced these same things. But we can never achieve the real experience solely on the basis of the tradition. The experience must come out of the living of our lives. And it is that experience that all these different teachers and authors have shared. And that is the reason why when they speak in a common tongue, and they report to us a common reality. One of the most exciting things about the period that we live in today is the magnitude of the crisis that we face. That magnitude enables us to reach into depths that we have never reached before. If you consider, for instance, that all of us face death, but that we have excuses, we have ways of avoiding it. Some reach to arts. They try to paint a masterpiece or write the great American novel, and they will somehow survive in that piece of work. Others feel they will survive through their children, through their families. There will be a kind of continuance. Their genes, their behavioral traits, their beliefs will continue through their children. Others perhaps build a great business or a political edifice, and they feel that they will somehow survive in that. These are not conscious decisions for the most part, but they are small ways of deriving solace in the face of death. Today, with the shadow of nuclear annihilation upon us, these ways no longer offer that solace. We cannot feel that the family, the work of art, the business, the political edifice we leave behind will survive for any great length of time. So we must face death more squarely. The root of all philosophy has been in facing that certainty, in accepting the reality of death, and then beginning that careful, lifelong process of attempting to understand what it is that dies. Do we actually die? Why is it that we deny it, that we cannot comprehend non-existence? Here, with these questions, begins Transcendentalism. The materialist, the dominant philosophical strain for the last several decades, does not ask these questions. To the materialist, they are unanswerable, they are foolish, and there is the death of philosophy in that perspective. The materialist philosopher is left arguing against idealism, certainly not philosophy, but simply argument, or working in linguistics, philosophy of science, and these sorts of fields. Fields which truly do not deserve the title philosophy, as that word comes down to us from Plato and Aristotle and the great philosophers of the past, who sought to understand the tremendous mysteries of creation. However, in the last decade, or so, some exciting things have been happening. And although many of us may still believe that the materialist philosophy is dominant today, and in fact, though it may be in many universities, especially in the bastions of learning in the East, such as Harvard and Yale, where in the philosophy departments one does not name Emerson, despite the fact that Emerson Hall is where philosophy is taught. Exciting things have been happening in the field of science. Physicists and biologists have made some very interesting discoveries. And the most exciting aspect for us, perhaps, is that in an attempt to describe these discoveries, they have turned to Transcendentalism. They have used the words of William Blake, of Buddha. They have quoted Emerson and Thoreau in an effort to describe scientific realities, because they have discovered that when physics is pushed as far as it can be pushed today, it begins to resemble Taoism, Buddhism, Transcendentalism, the mystical experience. In reading many of the most commanding young physicists working today, one often has a sensation of reading a mystical author. One will read such things as, the world behaves as if it were thought and not mind, or that the world is mind stuff. And those of you who have studied Eastern traditions will recognize these ideas. Those of you who have studied mysticism will recognize them also. A new theory, I will not bore you by going into depth, called the holographic theory of the brain, has put forth the conception that, in fact, the entire world is not available to our sensory apparatus, that there is nothing but event. Space and time are illusion. And of course, Kant had said this hundreds of years ago also. And that, in fact, the mind and the world are like holograms, like three-dimensional laser designs. And they appear to be solid or concrete to us because we put limits on them, because we name them, in a sense, with our sight, with our taste, with our scent. We slow them down. It's similar to the process that happens in our lives when something that we habitually encounter ceases to exist for us. We become so used to it that it no longer has meaning. And one day, perhaps, it does something we didn't expect, and it startles us into noticing it again. Some of you may perhaps have bought a painting or a poster that you really loved when you first saw it. It spoke to you, and you hung it up on your wall, and 2 months later, you completely forgot it was there, and when you'd look at it, you'd wonder why you actually liked it so much in the first place. It takes an effort to rediscover what was there, and sometimes it's never rediscovered because you have changed, and you have grown past the stage that is emblemed in that painting or poster. Now, this new theory of science can be reduced to one simple expression, and that is that the world as we see it is Maya, is illusion. And the traditions of India and of China, the Orient in general, then become vouchsafed by modern physics. And I beg you to trust me that these are not mystics in scientific garb. In fact, many of them are kicking when they have to make these kinds of statements. They have no intention of attempting to prove paranormal realities or transcendental experience. Yet it winds up proven by their efforts. And they will even wind up saying in their lectures such things as, perhaps seeing the future, perhaps a transcendental experience is natural and not supernatural. And perhaps the mystic who sees the future simply sees the reality underneath Maya, the first generation creator beneath the structures, the names, the hologram. An interesting thing about this is that if we turn to Plato, we will find that in his theory of forms, there is an almost exact correspondence with that way of looking at the world. The forms were supposed to be more real and in fact more conscious than this world, than anything in this world. They were the creators of this world. Later, the Neoplatonists would refer to them as gods of a secondary nature. And then, of course, there would be the one. And then there was the unmentionable beyond the one. Physics is moving in these directions. It has not reached the point where it would compare itself to Plato. There's a certain amount of reluctance in contemporary man to admit that someone who lived so long ago might have had an insight that we have not yet understood. But it is perhaps a good bet that before too long there will be startling correspondences between the traditions of Platonism and Neoplatonism, which grew out of the Greek mysteries, and physics as it exists today. But what does all this tell us? We feel maybe a little bit better that the materialistic stance that has created a great deal of trouble for our world is dying out from under us slowly. But where does it leave us? What good does it do us to know that there's an agreement between modern physics and Plato? I suppose if one saw that on the title of a book, we'd be sure to walk the other direction and find something a little bit more interesting. It can provide us reassurance that these realities are in fact real, that we're not fooling ourselves. It was a popular thing 100 years ago to reduce religious experience to infantile regression, or to state that it was simply borderline psychotic behavior. That kind of smugness is no longer with us, at least in the cases of those who have taken the time to examine the new data emerging from science. What do we do with the facts, though? We are assured, we know there's something to all this, but where do we turn? How do we act on it? What are our responsibilities here? The nature of transcendentalism is twofold. It is both a receiving and a giving. We receive wisdom, understanding, perception about the world. Emerson called this the transparent eye. That there were times when he would look out onto the world and he didn't exist. It was simply the world seeing the world through a vessel that others named Emerson. That kind of reception opens us to understand things, to see, to read gestures, to look out at the world and to derive lessons from nature, to look at a tree or the pattern of a leaf and gain an understanding about the nature of the world. But there is also a giving side to transcendentalism. There's a responsibility that goes with it. In America, the Transcendentalist Manifesto was a book called Nature by Emerson. It was the first released. It stated the Transcendentalist principles, and he began it by lamenting that we build sepulchres to our fathers, that our religion is nothing but the dead bones of our fathers' religions, and why can we not have a revelation of our own? Why can we not have direct contact with that which our fathers contacted and left to us in tradition? That is the receiving. But Emerson also spoke about the necessity of sharing that revelation, of promulgating these new ideas, of living them, ensouling them, becoming exemplars of them ourselves. Each of us at some point in our lives, often at many times in our lives, we find ourselves wondering why we are here. There must be more to it than simply existing. There must be more to it than simply enduring. Perhaps we have worked hard, we believe in some form of art or science or philosophy or whatever, a child. We have worked hard on something to do good by it, to advance it in the world. But even that, especially in the face of nuclear annihilation, even that fades from us. We begin to wonder, is that all there is to all of this? Sometimes we sit alone, and we are aware of the immensity of our own consciousness, all the memories, all the thoughts and experiences that we have had. And we know it is not possible for us to communicate all of that to another human being. Perhaps we are fortunate enough to be involved in a relationship in which we have known someone over a long period of time, and even then we know that all that great richness of consciousness that is within us is not completely expressible. We cannot show it all to another person, no matter how much time we are given. We begin to wonder, once again, why this richness? Why so much? Why isn't it put to use? What really is the point of being here? What are we to do? Many of us suffer frustration, a low key of anxiety and tension that is with us always. It may perhaps precipitate into the body as a soreness, a repetitive ache. It may precipitate into disease if it becomes severe enough. A constant sense that our limits are not being tested, that we are capable of more than we are given the opportunity to do. A frustration at these limits. What is it then that we are here to do? I'll suggest to you that it's again a two-sided response. We receive, we learn. We are here to learn. But we are also here to teach. Many of us who are on this spiritual path have become learners par excellence, or at least we believe so. We study, we watch, we observe, we try all the different techniques. We go to lectures and discussions. We listen. But few of us take the next step, which is in fact crucial to learning also, and that is a step of teaching. But what do we mean by teaching? Do we mean getting up in front of a chalkboard and boring everyone to sleep? Or do we mean rather that whenever we take a step, whatever that step may be, it becomes our responsibility to be available to others to help them achieve that step? Every step that we take puts us into a situation where we can help hundreds, dozens, several, one other person to make that step also. And these need not be esoteric matters. The entire history of parenthood is that kind of education. And that is education in its truest sense. The parent who says, I've been there, please trust me when I tell you to do or not to do this, is doing that kind of teaching. We have a responsibility, each of us, to teach then. But what is the best method of teaching? One of the dangers involved here is that teaching very easily becomes proselytizing. It's very simple to begin to berate our neighbors and friends with our theories and to inform them at every corner that they're dead wrong on this one, and go to our library and pull out a book to prove it too, which often makes them all the more stubborn. Really, the best way to teach is by example. All of you have probably contacted this idea somewhere. Teaching by example is the most profound. It's slow. It can be very frustrating for the teacher. When we make a discovery, we'd love to run out and broadcast it to the world. But often the world isn't ready to have that broadcasted to it. The world isn't really interested in that particular kind of discovery. There's other steps that have to be taken first. Teaching by example, then, depends on sensitivity, the very receptivity that good learning is based on. But it also depends on something else, and that is on the ability to be sensitive to others' needs and to communicate to them that we have the answer. Now, how do we do that? We do that by bringing into our lives some realities that are signified by some hopelessly cliche-ridden words, and those are love and happiness and security and serenity. had a place reserved in his hell for those people who would get up in the morning and not appreciate with ecstatic response the beauty of the world, who didn't look out at the glorious new sun and wonder at how awesome and tremendous the beauty of it was. Each of us, then, needs to cultivate appreciation of our world and of ourselves and of those around us. That happiness, that serenity, that love, which is the end of all studies, and which is perhaps an ideal that forever recedes away from us, that we can never completely ensoul, is the most effective kind of example and of teaching. It is like the philosopher's gold. It is a transmuting agent. The very presence of a person with that kind of serenity and personal happiness in a room changes the tone of conversation, can change the kinds of decisions made in that room. That kind of person has an effect that he or she may never be aware of, simply by being the kind of person that they are. I remember once being told a story, actually a parable, pointing out that the professor with a profound understanding of the intricacies of metaphysics may do far less good in this world than the waiter at the hot dog stand who has that serenity and that love. The difference being that so many people contact that waiter at the hot dog stand, and although they may be around him for only a moment, that mood, that sense of optimism is communicated. That cheerfulness lights up their day a little bit. So you see that we as learners have a tendency to forget that that simple thing, that cultivation of relaxation and of serenity and of the understanding that's required to see the goodness behind the apparent evil, to see the beauty behind the apparent ugliness. Cultivation of that is what all this study is about. And if all this study does nothing but get us involved in mazes of speculation and theories that we can hardly find anyone to speak to about because they're so complex, it's not really serving its point. We've gotten derailed somewhere along the line. All these ideas, all these abstruse metaphysical speculations are intended to help us see some very simple things and to realize them at profoundly deep levels. And these simple things are the common experience of humanity, of all life, perhaps of the entirety of creation, that there is more similarity between us than there is difference, that our problems and our worries are shared by our worst enemies, and that in fact the conflict that creates enmity between us is a shallow, shallow thing, with a tiny bit of understanding to be completely dissolved away from us. Note how in history, two warring peoples will be united when they are threatened. Note how two warring tribes will unite in defense against a third. How easily that conflict that kept them apart is dissolved when a new, more dangerous threat is with us. What is the nature, though, of the conflict? What is it that keeps us at each other's throats so often? These automatic reactions. Psychology has suggested to us that they are remnants of animal biology, of genetic response, defensive postures that were learned through millennium of evolution. But there's another element to them also, and that's the element of distraction. If one sees the world from the perspective of the common soul within it, one begins to wonder why it is that that consciousness loses itself so easily in distraction. And then one looks around and sees that distraction in our culture has become perhaps the most popular of all pastimes. That we have turned, for instance, sports into spectator sports, a kind of distraction. Many of us no longer even take part in the activity of sports. We simply watch. Television and film and radio all provide us with distraction. Sometimes some of you may have sat in a room where a conversation was taking place and been amazed that human beings could talk about such things, so completely unimportant. But there's distraction there. There's release from trouble. Distraction is one of two ways to face problems, to face trouble. The other way is transformation. Is to, in other words, enter the problem or accept it and be transformed by it. We can face the fact that we are in serious financial trouble, and we can decide to drink, turn on the television set, avoid it any way we can until the problem is decided for us or until we can no longer postpone it. We simply must act. Or we can enter into that problem, we can let it suffuse us, and that does not mean to become tense and anxiety-ridden over it at all. It means that first, we find a deeper security within ourselves. All that we have discussed here points to the essence of Transcendentalism. And the essence of Transcendentalism is trust. Not just trust in our fellows, but trust in creation. Trust in God or the primal force or whatever it is you wish to use to define the intelligence, the goodness, the principle of love that functions in the universe. The trust that enables us to say, I see much around me that seems evil to me and violent, but I will accept that I am a small and ignorant being and that I cannot see what is actually true here. I can even turn to some traditions that tell me that this is a dream, that in comparison to what I really am, what in India is called the Atman, the true self, all of this violence is nothing. Is but a game. The Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna that he must go into battle and he must kill, even if he must kill his relations, because there is no such thing as death. No one is being killed. It is simply play. It is simply a game of the soul that invests itself in matter to learn and to progress, to take lessons it could not take in its higher state. Imagine that you were an author and you were about to give birth to the most tremendous book ever written, and all your concentration was based on that. You had a great stack of paper in front of you and a brand new pen, and you set down the first word. And with that word, you forgot about yourself. You became the book. And you said with that first word, I am born. I have not existed before this. And then you wrote the book. And as you neared the last word, you became a little frightened. You began to think, this is ending now, and I'm going to die. And then you wrote the last word, expecting to be dead. You had forgotten how incredibly more conscious, how incredibly more complete you are than that simple writer of the book. You have invested everything in the story, and at the end of the story, feel the illusion of death. This, then, is Transcendentalism. The understanding that this is a story that we live. All the world's a stage, Shakespeare said, and has been called an initiate, perhaps simply on the basis of that statement. We play our parts, we learn, we progress, but we forget how truly superior to this we are, how truly conscious we are. That in a sense, this dimension of our existence flattens out and disappears when we can contact that higher dimension of experience, the wordless dimension. We must have trust to at least accept that this may be so until we can have the experience. We must seek out experiences that will lead to that greater experience. And this is where our studies can help us. Because the first thing that they can do is to assure us that the authors of these books had the experiences. The amazing inspirational value, cohesiveness, and power of many of these works is not the product of chance. It is a product of a higher consciousness. To the consciousness writing those works, they were not tremendous feats. They were in fact failures. Every author you read who has had that consciousness and seeks to lay it down will warn you, words cannot do it justice. I fail here. In India, there's a tradition called upaya. Upaya is to lie in the service of truth. It is the understanding that sometimes things have to be said in a way that is not strictly true when trying to teach these things, because there's no other way to do it. The words are not intended to be learned by rote and taken literally. They are intended to provoke you. They are not intended to be memorized. They are intended to make you experience something. And there may have been times when some of you had done studies and you have contacted an idea that deeply disturbed you. You may not have completely understood it, you may have understood it, but in any case, it left you disturbed. It seemed like a terrible thought. The disturbance may have been the author's intention, that alone. The author may not have actually believed what was written there, but knew that that reaction needed to be provoked in many people, and would be provoked in them when they read what he had written. If we can trust that that kind of experience is available to us, we have taken the first step to having it. Because if we do not believe it is possible, we cannot have the experience. Even those who claim the most abrupt conversions, who say that they were livid materialists and atheists, and then one day had an experience that opened their eyes, have a kernel of belief in them. One will note that usually those people are the ones who were staunch believers in the other way, so there was an element of belief in their denial, in the strength of it. Those who simply don't care about the issues, those who don't care whether the world is matter or spirit, these seldom have conversion experiences. They are not so involved in the process. There is no faith invested. When we conceive that the world we see, the world that we live in, is not all that there is, and that deep within us we can contact the greater realities, then we begin the process of transmutation. Then we begin to change in subtle ways, sometimes in great ways. We begin to accept things we hadn't accepted before. We begin to move toward a greater simplicity. The confusion, the frustration, the anxiety that most of us suffer at times or often, these are always the result of our confused perception of the world, our complexity, our disorganization. When we begin to notice that there are laws in this world, that there are causes and effects in our psychologies, in our behavior, we begin to observe ourselves and our experiences, to notice that anger at one who is angry earns us nothing, only aggravates the situation. We begin to learn that because we have our heart set on something, losing it becomes all the more painful. Or that when we drive after something and achieve it, it loses its taste. These are all lessons that we must pay careful attention to, because they are teaching us the laws of living. They are teaching us the way to these experiences of greater reality. The laboratory in which this takes place is in each of our lives. It is each of our lives. The people that we are around, the environment that we live in, everything that we contact and have interaction with provides us with the opportunity for this kind of change. There is a tendency for human beings to fall in love with glamour. We see it all around us. And we see it also upon the spiritual path. Glamour is one of the first pitfalls and one of the last. It is a very easy thing to fall into the glamour of the metaphysical or transcendental perspective of life, to feel that it somehow sprinkles stardust around us, that we have now become one of the elect in that we even see these things. And in fact, there is a certain amount of truth in that. And yet, see what is actually happening when we think that way. We are turning around and looking at those who come behind us. And we are saying, well, I'm doing pretty well in comparison to that line back there. And rather than helping them, rather than saying, I've had an exciting experience, let me share it with you, we are distancing them. We are saying, I'm different than you, I'm better, I'm elect. Now, even better than that, we are forgetting to look ahead of us at those who are far, far beyond where we are. Were we to do that, we would be quickly restored to balance. We would quickly realize that we have our responsibilities that we are set for to aid those who are in line behind us, and there are those to aid us in line in front of us. And that line continues infinitely in both directions. And in that sense, we are in no better or worse place than anyone else. We are in the right place. And there again is trust. To trust that we are in the right place. So many of us feel that if we could only live somewhere else, or find just the right person to be with, or the right book, or the right teacher, then the rest would open before us. Then we would find paradise. But what we are given is right for us at this time. The people we are around and the environment we are in is right. If it is making us unhappy, that is because we are not making proper use of it. If it seems boring, that is because we have not applied sufficient imagination and understanding to take out of it what is there. One of the really lovely methods used in various forms of transpersonal psychology, a method that's been passed down from various mystical schools, is to sit a pupil down with a very boring object, perhaps a dead fish or a piece of wood, and make that pupil spend hours and days writing down everything that he or she can think of that has to do with that fish or that piece of wood. And of course what happens is that the pupil, after several hours of this, is astounded by all the associations that come to mind. In a sense, it seems as though the whole world can be derived from that little fish or that little piece of wood, and that is in fact the truth. And then the teacher comes around and looks at the page and says, well, this won't do it all. You'll have to sit for another week and do it. And there is this continuing surprise at how much can really be taken from that. And the lesson to be learned is that wherever we find ourselves, the most boring situations, the most inconvenient, offer us endless opportunity. We can calm ourselves. We can search for serenity if we're perhaps waiting in a doctor's office. We can calm ourselves and observe ourselves. We can look around us and see what sorts of lessons there are. We can look at the other persons and observe them. We can look perhaps at the form of the furniture. We can play little games with ourselves, such as wondering who made the furniture, where the wood came from, how many people were actually involved in putting that chair where it is. It will be shocking to you how many people you owe a debt of gratitude for this chair you're sitting on right now. How many people worked hard to make that chair? How many people were involved in bringing it here? The tree that was cut down to make it. The metal that was involved in bolting it. Many people and much time were involved. When you leave here and you drive on the road, consider for a moment that it was not so long ago when there was nothing here but fields and brush. and wonder how many people were involved in building that road that you will drive on and take for granted. How many people were involved in planning it, finding it, building it? How much tar and asphalt was breathed in order to make it a reality? All around us, there is tremendous resource for gratitude, for appreciation, and for awe. Simply must open ourselves to see it. It is not that we must make an effort to see it, because in fact, I will suggest to you that the effort is in not seeing it. That the reason that so many of us are so tired so much, the reason that so many of us seem to practically be pulled down by gravity, is that there is so much effort involved in not seeing these things, in putting up barriers, in limiting our senses, limiting our appreciation. One of the easiest things to do is to simply appreciate. Consider for a moment a time in your lives when you stood perhaps before a beautiful landscape, or perhaps you marveled in the presence of someone who you had fallen in love with. Whatever situation, you ceased to think, you simply experienced. You looked out perhaps at the beautiful landscape and were amazed. There's nothing tiring about that. In fact, there's a tremendous energy involved in it. And often after that kind of experience, we feel very good. Some of you may practice such arts as yoga or various Oriental martial arts. And although there's a tremendous amount of effort involved in them, after you're finished, there's a rush of energy. There's a well-being about it all when you've done those exercises properly. So you see, the effort is not involved in becoming enlightened. And if you look into Zen, you will find that there is constant reference to how easy it is. It's a lazy man's path. And in fact, what you must learn is to be lazy and simple and open. Or we can turn to Christianity, where one must be as a child to enter into the kingdom of heaven. The stress is on simplicity and openness and wonder. Being able to really see the world as much as we can and not as little as we can. It is perhaps part of our biological heritage that we must limit, that we must set blinders on ourselves so that we can survive, so that we can eat, so that we can drink, so that we can deal with others and with our environment, build shelter. And yet, the nature of our civilization has made these problems much simpler and has opened new problems for us. We are able to open our consciousness in new ways and are forced to restrict it in new ways. The hunter, who 10,000 years ago was forced to find his food and shoot it down, had other splendid rewards for the kind of sensual limitation necessary in detecting the prey. He moved through wilderness and felt a sense of oneness with it, a sense of interaction with it, saw things that most of us never see. Now we, with that same hunter's predilection in our senses, move in a very different world. That kind of specialization is no longer necessary. We can afford to be far more open, and in fact we have to be. And here again is that pressure, the ordeal that leads to evolution, to continuing growth of consciousness. Here again is a demand made upon us by evolution, by the continuance of our experience as a species. Now, we must begin to cultivate new virtues that would have been inappropriate to the hunter. And then, in a sense, we must remake our senses. We must learn to see things that the hunter would not have seen. We must learn to be sensitive to things that would have destroyed the hunt. Look around you at those who have committed themselves to being successes, to having money or power, and you will see the hunter at work. You will see how close the attention is on the prey and how little anything else is noticed. These people will often tell you things like, that is unimportant, I have no time for that. That is the hunter mentality. What happens to many of these people shows us that it is no longer an appropriate mentality. The unhappiness, the misery, the disease that is rampant in our culture, the anxiety, the very tremendous magnitude of the problems that face us all as a culture prove to us that that mentality will no longer serve. And so we turn and we wonder, where does nature direct us? Who are the happy ones? Who are the serene ones? Who are the ones who are successful in this culture? Who are the ones that we would wish to emulate, to have a life similar to? And we will find that these are people who have very different perceptions of the world. A psychologist named Abraham Maslow opened up a kind of revolution in psychology. He founded a school called humanistic psychology that rejected the Freudian and animal-based behavioral modes of psychology, and then later decided that even humanistic psychology would not be sufficient. He founded a new school and called that transpersonal psychology, and based it heavily on mysticism and on the Eastern traditions. Maslow named these kinds of people self-actualizers. He said that these were people of good soul, people who were truly healthy. Maslow complained that all psychology before him, before this new movement, studied the sick, studied the abnormal, studied those who were not applying their potential as human beings, or studied animals who were quite different from humans. And Maslow proposed that instead there should be a school of psychology who will study those who are truly healthy, who are really actualizing their potential. And he coined a phrase which in many circles is now a cliché, self-actualizers. He described these people, named a few in history, found many living today, and recorded their views about life, their experience of life. The agreement between them was remarkable. We will recognize all of these feelings from our own studies in spirituality, from some of our own experiences. These people were patient with others. They had a sense of abiding trust in the world, a sense that in their lives and in what they could observe, things always seemed to happen well, that the disaster looming ahead of them, when lived through, was a kind of blessing. And when they could not see the blessing, they would patiently wait until they were wise enough to see it, assuming that it was there, that there was a reason why this had happened. These self-actualizers were creative people. They were people who did not feel particularly joined to a place or a nation or a race. They were people who felt that they were citizens of the planet Earth, global citizens. It was difficult for them to become involved in politics. The idea of war was unthinkable. In short, everything that we know about them indicates to us that they saw the world, their perspective was the result of the kinds of studies and observances that we make as we continue on the spiritual path. That the efforts that each of us are now involved in led to that kind of perspective on the world. And that they are, in fact, the most excellent examples of what is available to us as human beings. And one of the most marvelous things about them was how often they reported happiness, serenity, joy, intermittent feelings of ecstasy. Again, Maslow, a scientist who had been trained in animal research, was forced to turn to Eastern and Western mysticism to find the kind of phrases that would explain the experience that these self-actualizers had. Since Maslow passed away, others have come on the scene. Some of you have perhaps read books by them. Many of these books have been bestsellers. Marilyn Ferguson wrote a book called The Aquarian Conspiracy. Fritz F. Capra wrote The Turning Point. There have been many others in which it is being suggested that we are all now facing a period of evolutionary crisis, and that in order to meet that, there is now arising among us groups, networks, individuals who have had these kind of experiences or who are dedicated to having them. Practitioners, we might say, of the transcendental path. If there are more today than there ever have been, and perhaps a proof of that might be that these books are indeed bestsellers. And in reading them, one may discover ideas that are very similar to Rosicrucian conceptions, to conceptions of secret societies throughout history, now out in the open, now quite popular. There are now networks developed, existing, in which someone, having had such an experience in a small town somewhere where no one else had had such a thing, and afraid perhaps that they were going mad, can pick up the phone and call and be referred to someone in their area, or at least someone on the telephone who can speak to them about their experience. There are now networks and clearinghouses existing that are set up to put these kinds of people together with each other, to spread out information. Some are devoted to promulgating scientific research that supports these ideas. Others correlate that research to religious traditions. Still others discuss the way that these ideas are implemented in industry. Some form publishing cooperatives. Some form living cooperatives. These authors suggest that what we are seeing in politics today, this tremendous decline in voting, which is being addressed by politicians as a lack of responsibility, they suggest that this is not a lack of responsibility, but simply the result of a perception on the parts of increasingly greater numbers. The perception that the political system as it exists will no longer function for these people. They do not wish to vote for the candidates who are available to them, and so they do not vote. Not a lack of responsibility, perhaps a bad decision, but motivated not in boredom, but in this new perception. In short, signs are all around us of these kinds of changes. Many of these new ideas have not yet filtered down, but we would be surprised by the effect of them in schools and on our children. We would be surprised at the kind of world that our children are growing up in. And we must remember that the vast, quick changes taking place throughout our lifetimes are the very ground on which these children begin their growth. That they begin with assumptions that it took us precious effort to learn and accept. These are natural to them. And they also contribute to this acceleration, this change. Arguments could perhaps be mustered that this is a blind optimism, and that Marilyn Ferguson and Fritz of Capra choose very carefully their data, and that there are other depressing facts that could be rallied also. Still, the very existence of such works and such ideas in such large numbers indicates a chance. We may not feel optimistic enough to say that it's a sure thing, that this will all come to be, that the change is preordained and will happen. We may not accept that, but we can accept that there is a chance, that all of us are involved in a very exciting chance. All the efforts then that we make toward self-improvement, all the efforts that we make toward contacting others with interests like our own, in a sense, all the efforts that we make to transform our interest from a hobby or an obsession to an ensouling principle of our life contributes then to the odds in favor of this chance. Every effort that we make toward cultivation of a serene, kindly, loving, understanding disposition contributes also. And so you see there's a double reward involved in this effort. If it is not enough that happiness can be ours through that kind of self-cultivation, if that reward of nature is insufficient for us to decide that we should pursue such a path and to devote ourselves to it, and there have been many who would tell you that that is so. There have been articles in the New York Times written saying, I'm miserable and I'm glad I'm miserable, and I think one should be miserable in the world as it is today. It's a very popular opinion. If that isn't enough, then add to it the additional reason that in cultivating oneself, one is contributing to this chance, to this solution to the problems. And then one can even add a variation on Pascal's famous wager, which was that if you don't believe in God, you might as well try to, because if there is no God, it doesn't matter one way or the other. If there is, you're in trouble if you don't believe in Him. We can make a slight variation on that and say that since we are going to pass out of this sphere, and since we are truly not sure where it is we go, or if we go anywhere at all, we may as well devote ourselves to the paths that seem to promise an answer to that problem. That answer may be a simple serenity where the problem dissolves from us and we do not consider it. And we are so sufficiently centered and balanced that we feel we will face death when it comes to us. And that we will face the beautiful world before us at this moment completely, reserving nothing for such worries as death. We can decide that we will pursue any effort that will bring sustenance to these deep hungers. Because in our society, and in most of our cases, for most of us who have interest in these things, we do not have to worry about the basal physical hungers for food and shelter. Others have these problems. We have new needs on a hierarchy of needs that must be satisfied. We have needs for spiritual sustenance and for mental and emotional sustenance. And we must discover how best to feed those needs, because in so doing we grow, and then new needs are opened onto us. Aiding one another is perhaps the best way to satisfy those needs. Unfortunately, aiding one another, because of the history of it, because of the sometimes funny nature of many charities, and the sometimes strange motivations that lurk beneath apparent charity, has taken a bad name and has also been restricted. Normally, when one speaks of charity these days, one thinks of going to work with starving children in India, or writing a nice fat check to someone that we never see and in whose work we are not involved. But charity is much wider than that. We owe a kind of charity to our world, to those around us. We owe a charity of sharing our experience, of asking questions and answering them, a charity of transmuting our lives into spiritual quests and adventures. The other charity of giving to those who have more basic needs is also important, and that also opens. But it is not something that will open to us until we have achieved a certain level where that kind of effort seems like the only thing that we can do. Many of us torture ourselves because we feel that we should be more responsible to those who suffer, that we just don't show enough care. We think about hungry children, or we think about tortured animals, and we think we really should be making some sort of an effort, yet we can't seem to do that. The time is not right. There are other lessons that must be learned. There are other requirements that must be filled. And once again, we must have trust that when the time is right, then the opportunity will come. The old saying When the pupil is ready, the teacher will be there, can be widely generalized, because the teacher is not necessarily a person, an illustrious initiate, or some tremendous teacher from the East, or from a mysterious mountain. The teacher can be an experience. It can be a demand made on us. It can be a requirement that we must face and do not want to. In fact, every moment of our lives we are surrounded with teachers. Returning once again to the idea that when you apparently have nothing to do and feel bored, look around for teachers. Let the chair that you're sitting on be a teacher to you. You could derive the entire system of Taoism, of the yin and the yang, from that chair that you're sitting on, from the way that it both supports and receives, and from the mystery of that. You might look out the window at the sun. The sun has inspired most every great teacher that has ever written or spoken. The sun has been one of the most excellent symbols of deity available to us. So you might look at the sun and wonder a while at that. You might look at a tree. You might recall to yourselves that in all the great religious traditions there are references to trees of life. And in the Hebrew Kabbalah, that symbol became the key to the universe, the golden key they called it. You might look at the tree and at the way that the roots must grow down deep into the earth to support the branches that are stretched up. You might look at the design of the branches. You might consider the seasons that the tree meets and learn some very important things. You might look at the chair and the tree and the sun and relate them to your own experiences, to your own psychologies, your own consciousness. And again, discover some very exciting, interesting things. Teachers are all around us, and we are always ready to be taught. That phrase, when the student is ready, the teacher will be there, is not some dangling carrot in space and time, that somewhere up ahead, when we've been very good, we'll find a teacher, maybe. It's not that at all. It's that the teachers are around us now, and we are students now. Whether we care to listen to them or not, this is our own affair. But the lesson is available for us. All of these things, the sun, the chair on which you sit, the tree, are teaching by the best method. The method we talked about earlier, the method of example, that quiet method. And one can sense a serenity in these things that has been mistaken, has been called immateriality, or has been called inanimation, lifelessness, or has been called inferiority. But there is a serenity in all the rest of creation that seems to be lacking within ourselves. All the rest of creation is like a siren calling us to this serenity, this trust, this happiness. We look out at the blossoming flowers or at the vegetables ripening on the vine. And there are lessons there of patience. How many of us have attempted to sit in a garden from dawn to dawn? How many of us could do that? And yet consider that the tree, granted a different species of life, stands in its place, grows, actually a whirl of activity in that garden for years. And imagine if you could invest your own consciousness in that tree. Have to make it a bit more serene, perhaps, otherwise you'd likely die of boredom. But if you could be serene and conscious in that tree, what would you see? What would you experience? Would not the universe unfold before you? We are drowned in a glut of teachers and knowledge and information. We zip into our cars, zip across freeways, zip on airplanes, are exposed to a tremendous variety of sights and sounds and experiences. And there is in fact so much of it that it becomes distraction. It becomes almost impossible for us to open ourselves to it. We must close up our parameters simply to survive the bombardment of it all. Drive on the freeway in rush hour, and you will experience how necessary it can be to deny all that, to close up the senses. It becomes very hard to relax and to accept and to look around and experience the potential lessons in that situation. Why? Because it demands change of us. Most of us fear change, and those of us who are addicted to distraction and to denial, to that mode of dealing with problems, especially fear change. Change, transformation, is the other way of dealing with these problems. And we are afraid that we may discover things that will require us to change. We may be sitting in our car at rush hour on the freeway, and we may open ourselves and relax and suddenly realize how incredibly absurd our situation is. And there will be a demand, perhaps, from our innermost self at that point that we must leave, that this is too absurd to continue. There may not be that demand, but there may be that demand. And then we are faced with a dilemma, a whole new set of problems. We begin the litany of how can I leave? And we begin to name all the various reasons why we cannot leave. But we will never forget that insight at that moment, that what we are doing is foolish, that we are involved in a truly foolish activity. If it is true that there is no way that we can leave, we can at least learn to laugh. We can learn to see ourselves, fallen gods as we are called, sitting in our car in rush hour, in a perfectly foolish situation. And then perhaps wonder if the deity doesn't have a tremendous sense of humor watching all of this. The movies, television shows that many of us watch stress adventure. Everything seems to be lived on the edge. The soap opera, which can be to some people one of the most boring experiences in creation, can be very exciting to those who see that it exists on the edge of an emotional abyss. There is always something emotionally traumatic about to happen. Children who are addicted to cops and robbers or westerns watch their heroes always on the edge of death and violence and injury. All of these kinds of interests are showing us that we like those, we admire those, we want to perhaps be like those who live their lives on the edge of change, on the edge of the abyss, who accept the dangers. The gunfighter who goes out to the OK Corral is not being reasonable and giving himself a litany of why he shouldn't go there. If he did, he certainly wouldn't have. These examples in adventure films of great travelers who have gone up the Nile or who have climbed Everest alone, have the same kind of effect on us. The sense of, how could somebody do that? And then perhaps the matching remark, which is when we begin to fool ourselves, well, I couldn't do that. That remark is the precise reason why most of us could not. Yes, there are physical limitations, yet each of us has a purpose, a meaning, a reason for being here that would demand the utmost from us. Each of us can be living on the edge of that kind of abyss. The image in Buddhism is that of the Bodhisattva, who, about to achieve enlightenment, must stand on the edge of an abyss. Space stretches away infinitely before him, above him, and below him. The Bodhisattva has no idea what he is about to step into, but trust in the goodness of creation must be sufficient for him, and he steps off, knowing that an action taken with such faith can never lead to harm, knowing that the universe is suffused with a kind wisdom and a goodness, a benevolence intended to help us and not to impede us. So the abyss that each of us could stand on the limit that each of us could meet, is not an abyss of catastrophe, but an abyss of wonder. Listen sometimes to the report of a race car driver or someone else involved in some sort of dangerous sport or work. Sometimes the interviewer will ask them, how do you do that? How do you maintain control of the car? And they will say, I don't. The car and I are one. A Zen Roshi would be very proud of that response. And in truth, the car and the driver are one. There's a new kind of consciousness there. The race car driver is to us on the abyss of catastrophe. But the reason that he is a race car driver is because for himself, he is on the abyss of an ecstasy, the likes of which most of us are never fortunate enough to experience. That ecstasy can be physical, it can be intellectual, it can be emotional, it can involve all those aspects. Because what it actually is the suffusion of that part of ourselves with the spiritual self, with the soul, with the truly conscious part of ourselves. Those are the moments when we are beyond even trust, when we simply are. This is what we must seek out. This is what we are here to do. And so, if we happen to be sitting on the freeway, and we happen to see that there's a terrible rush hour around us, and we happen to see how foolish the whole thing is, and when we hear that litany begin, why I cannot leave, what I did this summer, that sort of thing, what we should always remember at that point is that we are here for a limited span. We are not even sure why we are here. Are we so content? Are we so challenged by our current life that there is no reason for us to leave, that there is nowhere else, no experience that would do us good? Or are we tied down to our denial and our fear of change? Perhaps the very reasons that we muster as to why we cannot leave are the very lessons that we must learn. If it is because we have a house that is worth a lot of money and we don't think we could do as well elsewhere and the taxes would be too much, well, that tells us something right away, that our financial security, our financial worries are more important to us than our spiritual well-being. We are willing to damage our souls sitting in that car in rush hour day after day. But we are not willing to risk, to have trust that an action motivated by faith and by a desire to improve ourselves will end well. We are not willing to attempt the experiment. And we will never know if perhaps we would have done the right thing, if perhaps the very thing that we feared would have turned to a blessing for us. We may decide that we cannot leave because we must act as guides. We must act as teachers to our children or our friends. We have responsibility to these people. And yet, the very act of leaving may be the most crucial lesson we can ever teach them, that we are willing to drop those kinds of concerns in favor of what our spiritual evolution demands. These are difficult questions, sometimes paradoxical. They take a great deal of sensitivity, they take time, a quiet, observing disposition. We cannot decide from one experience of the foolishness of rush hour that we must immediately move to Tibet and live in a mountain. We must wait and observe. We must see if we can change in smaller ways. Perhaps we can change a job or find another route. There may be ways that this problem can be corrected that do not require such radical change. But we must apply creativity and recognize that the problem itself, this foolishness of the rush hour traffic, is challenging us to be creative enough to avoid it. It is challenging us to be transformed by it. When we deny, when we pull away, when we turn back away from the challenge, we only request further, more serious challenge. Consider the evolution of illness. Consider that it may begin with a stress of not dealing with the tension of the rush hour traffic. 10 years, morning and afternoon, of frustration at it for a sustained period of time, and no effort at creativity, simple denial, no sacrifice perhaps to get away from that tension by rising above it, and not by simply avoiding it, by turning the radio louder and slowly fuming. Perhaps from that develops a kind of stomach problem, an ailment in our stomach, an ulcer perhaps, caused by tension. And that perhaps does not stimulate us to creativity. We still do not make the decision that avoiding change is avoiding self-development and transformation, that the change is helpful and not a threat. And then perhaps that ulcer becomes more serious, and perhaps it can become a fatal condition. But each of these steps, each step at which the problem becomes more serious and more demanding, is simply another challenge. The illness is not an evil thing. The illness is not an enemy that we must conquer. The illness simply is. Our response to it is what matters. The avoidance of the illness in denial is what harms us. But accepting the challenge, learning to read it, and here is the key, learning to read it, believing that there is meaning in this book of the world, believing that it is an experience, a sequence of events established for our benefit, to help us to learn and to understand, to deepen our understandings of ourselves and of others, and to see problems in terms of a stimulus to that kind of understanding, to read them in that way, then opens us to a whole new world. We begin to crave transformation, and this also can become a problem. Often, after the first time we take that kind of a risk and it works out beautifully, we begin to look for risks. In astrology, this is ruled by the planet Uranus. And an interesting thing about this is that Uranus is supposed to be the power that disrupts the limitations set upon us by Saturn. Now, an interesting fact is that Saturn is the last of the personal planets. It's the last of the planets, in a sense, under our control. Uranus, the planet of change and disruption, is called transpersonal, a higher octave planet, and it is not under our control. It works upon us. So you see that the individual who seeks that kind of change, who searches for it everywhere, is really moving past his or her responsibility. That individual should rather be patient, should be looking, listening, waiting for the challenges. Each of us has many in our own lives. Our own dispositions provide us with a wealth of problems we can deal with the rest of our lives in most cases. So we deal with these, and we don't look for the more spectacular ones. Because in fact, the spectacular ones are usually nothing more than doors. When some tremendous change is required from us, one can be fairly assured that there is some very deeply ingrained habit or some very deep disharmony between ourselves and our environment that must be overcome for growth to continue. And once we find a place, a situation, an environment that is more conducive to our spiritual development, then these radical shifts are no longer necessary. We can set ourselves to the quiet work. We can set ourselves to the quiet work of alchemical transmutation, of changing those vicious aspects of our personality into virtues. It's an interesting thing that those very vices are really just the polar opposites of their virtues. Everything in creation has that kind of polarity. And everything in creation has the gender of passive and aggressive. And it's very often that one of our vices is simply a virtue over or under expressed. And that by observing and by careful adjustment, we can transform that vice into a virtue. Anger can become a kind of fortitude. Jealousy can become a kind of appreciation. We need to examine the roots of these vices that torment us. And we also need to consider the best way to be rid of them. Do we fight the vice? When we become angry, do we punish ourselves for being angry? Or do we simply cultivate the appropriate virtue and allow that to replace the vice? Like turning a light on in a dark room. If I gave you a shovel and directed you to take all the darkness out of the room, you would undoubtedly consider me mad. And yet, that's what most of us try to do when we fight anger or with intellect. When we set ourselves carefully watching, so that the very next time we get mad, we will stop ourselves. And of course, we get even madder the next time. Turn on the light. That will dispel the darkness. Seek the virtue. Practice patience. Practice relaxation. Make it, its fact, into a game. Look around when you're in a particularly irritating situation and find the most incredibly irritating aspect of it. Find a person you just can't even bear to be around and watch them and begin to notice how much more similarity there is between you and that person than there is difference. Begin to notice that perhaps that incredible anger that person shows, or that insensitivity, is a result of a great amount of pain. And that person is not happy in tormenting you. Because in fact they are not tormenting you, they are tormenting themselves. And you are tormenting yourself by your response to them. They are not compelling you to react with unhappiness to their unhappiness. You choose to do so. You could react with sympathy, with love, with understanding. Or you could react with indifference, but you needn't react with anger to anger or unhappiness to unhappiness. You could perhaps transmute their anger or their unhappiness with your own serenity and happiness. Instead of being affected by their vice, you could perhaps affect them with your virtue. Consider the flexibility. And consider also that very often the very thing you like least about somebody is a warped reflection of something you don't like about yourself. Try applying that little ruler. You'll be amazed at how well it works. Sometimes people who have vices that we never consider as having anything to do with ourselves will in some way, it turns out, reflect our own behavior. Maybe in a very different way. Maybe their kind of anger and our kind of anger are very different. Maybe they are very vocal with their anger, and they're angry at everyone indiscriminately. But maybe we are very quietly angry at one person. And it's our own unhappiness at our own anger, our own variety of it, that makes us so sensitive to their anger. The truly peaceful and serene and understanding human being does not react with anger to anger, is not in any way affected by it. Even as the brightest light cannot be swallowed in darkness unless it is doused. All of this is within our reach. It is in fact so simple, so wonderfully simple, that our complex natures tend to miss it. We look for the harder responses. We indulge ourselves in the distractions of our vices. And do not realize that, in fact, the slight pleasure we get in that distraction stands in the way of the tremendous pleasure that the virtue would offer us. The kind of serenity and peace, the kind of understanding, the feeling of belonging that comes to one who has a serene, clear disposition, who can sit in a room full of hostile persons and yet feel at peace, and yet feel that here are all fellow humans with similar problems, basic goodness. A person who can approach the world with trust and who can change the lament of why are things as they are to a celebrative song, how wonderful things are just as they are, becomes a powerful transmuting agent in this world. We talked about the crisis of evolution facing all of us. Each of you who sit here, by your very presence, show an interest and a responsibility in that process. You have come here to a place that has a very special meaning to it, a meaning all of you are aware of, meaning all around you in the hangings on the walls, in the bookstore, in the library, amongst the various lecturers. All of you display a commitment of some sort, at least an interest or curiosity in that. And I suggest to you that that in itself shows you the direction that you must take, shows you that the misery that you may suffer, the frustration and limitation you may now feel, is a result of not having yet found the meaning in life. The meaning in life which is to receive of the wisdom of this creation and the Creator, to be as a receptive cup before that wisdom, and to be like the bull, the great horned bull, the force working for deity, teaching by example, patiently, slowly, faithfully. All of you deserve great trust and deserve to give it. Thank you. And there will be a study group meeting.